From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. There is one big story for most of us today, and that is those inflation numbers, the CPI numbers that came out this morning. And to give us a sense of just how bad they were, we turned out to Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So as far as I can tell, Mike, they were higher than almost anybody anticipated.
Higher than almost anybody anticipated and higher than most Americans can even remember. It was 1981, Ronald Reagan's first year in office. Paul Volcker was raising interest rates like crazy to choke off inflation. The last time we had a CPI at 9.1% on a year-over-year basis. So the numbers are pretty bad. And for Joe Biden, it is definitely not a good look. But even for Jay Powell at the Fed, because much of the inflation is in the supply side where they can't have much impact. Gasoline prices up 11.2%. And look at that price on a year-over-year basis, 59.9%. Food at home still up another percentage point. And owner's equivalent rent, this is going to be an ongoing problem. It's the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates home prices. Those are up 0.7, up 5.5% on the year. And that's going to keep happening because even though home sales have slowed, prices really haven't started coming down. Used cars surprised to the upside, and so did apparel. We thought with a lot of the inventory build that might go down, but instead it was up 0.8. So not a good look at all, and made worse for the president by the fact that the inflation-adjusted average hourly earnings fell by 3.6%. That's the most in the history of that index. Americans are not at all keeping up with inflation, even if they are getting raises, David.
Mike, you mentioned the president, who, of course, is over in Israel right now. But, of course, he had a reaction to the CPI numbers. And as best I could figure out, what he was saying is, look, don't worry about this. They're backward looking. A lot of it's gasoline prices, which you just mentioned. In fact, those are already coming down. And if we want to do anything about it, get Congress to pass some legislation about things like prescription drugs. Is he right?
Well, he is right. And this is backward-looking data, and that's a problem for the Fed because they have to try to figure out where inflation will be when any moves they make hit the markets. But the problem for the president is people are still looking at their gas tanks, and even though prices have come down, they're still high. We are going to see inflation decline. It's a question of when it starts because we've seen gasoline prices fall. We're seeing agricultural commodities fall. And we're seeing other aspects of inflation that had risen because of the pandemic start to fall. But the question for the president and for Democrats running for office this fall is how fast will it come down? Will we see enough of an impact by November?
Okay, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. That's Bloomberg's Michael McKee reporting on the CPI numbers. And now we want to get an understanding from an economist about exactly what these numbers may mean. And for that, we turn to Pimco economist Allison Boxer. Allison, thanks for being back with us here. Let me pick up, first of all, on this question of gasoline and to some extent food, because I understand those prices are starting to come down. What about the relationship of headline, as it's called, inflation to core?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think the message from today's CPI report was that we're seeing that inflation is becoming more broad-based and possibly more entrenched across a variety of goods and services. So while I think we could see some temporary relief, especially on the energy price side, some recent relief on gas prices, I think really the challenge for the Fed and for the U.S. economy more broadly is that even if we were to see some relief on the headline side, thanks to gas prices, it looks like core inflation is likely to be, sort of stickier and possibly more entrenched from here for longer.
And some of that, Allison, as I understand it, is what Mike just talked about, that OER number, the owner equivalent rent number, which went up. Is that going to continue to go up as far as we can tell?
Yeah, I think, again, the challenge really here for the Fed is that this OER measure, the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, chooses to measure shelter price inflation, it's a rental price measure. And really what we've seen over time is that this tends to be fairly sticky and quite slow moving. So even if we were to see, the broader economy start to react more quickly to what's going on with interest rates and just inflation more generally, this OER measure, this rental price measure, is likely to only adjust very slowly. So this high shelter price inflation that we're seeing today and that really we've seen over the past several months, is likely to remain relatively sticky.
So obviously raises the question of what does this say to the Fed? They're already pricing in 75 basis points for the next meeting. Some people are even talking about 100 basis points. What are you expecting?
Yeah, I think the message again for the Fed today is likely that, monetary policy needs to get back into contractionary territory. Fed funds today is still below their estimates of neutral. And just given the breadth and strength of today's CPI report, that no longer seems appropriate. So I think we're likely to see another very hawkish Fed meeting at the upcoming meeting in July, as well as likely, in September and possibly even beyond that. I think certainly 100 basis points will at least be a point of discussion for the Fed. We saw the Bank of Canada actually came out this morning and surprised with a 100 basis point hike. And as you mentioned, we've already seen some Fed officials start to sort of discuss this as well. So I think it will at least be a point of discussion, and sort of regardless of what ends up happening, I think we're likely to see quite a hawkish tone from the July FOMC meeting.
So we're still in this quandary about recession versus inflation, I think, and these numbers don't help us any. We have an inverted yield curve now. The 2s, 10s are something up like 16 basis points now. Started out the day like under 10 inverted. Is that signaling a recession in your judgment?
Yeah, I think we've started to see, market participants and economists and Fed officials more broadly, start to grapple with this slower growth outlook. And I think the challenge from today's data is that stickier inflation and therefore a stronger Fed reaction, raises recession risks. And it also raises the risk that this recession could happen sooner and that it could potentially be more severe, than if this hadn't happened.
Well, and how much of this is inside either the president's power or, more importantly, the Fed's power as a practical matter? Because we do have geopolitical concerns. We don't know what's going to happen with the war with Ukraine. We don't know what's going to happen with Russian gas into Europe. And by the way, we don't really know what's going to happen with the Chinese economy and any possible further shutdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard Chair Powell, acknowledge this repeatedly. The Fed wants to get monetary policy back into a more contractionary stance. They want to do their part to help cool demand and get the economy into sort of bettered balance. But ultimately, a lot of this is out of their control. Chair Powell has sort of repeatedly said that the Fed can't control food and energy prices, and I think that's why we've seen sort of adjustments from the Fed to date, and also why they're in a really difficult sort of position right now.
Does it bother you at all, as an economist, that we seem to be getting the numbers wrong every time?
I think it's certainly been an interesting time and a challenging time for economic forecasting. And I think this is sort of, regardless of whether you look at private sector forecasters, financial services, Fed officials, sort of across the board. And really, I think we've just seen a very quick adjustment, a very rapid, economic cycle, if you will. And that's very different than what we were all used to in sort of the 10-year period following the GFC and before the COVID pandemic recession.
Okay, Allison, thank you so much for being back with us. Really appreciate it. That's Pimco's Allison Boxer on those CPI numbers. And now we have a bit of breaking news coming across the terminal as we've been talking. And there's an early read now on that contest for the leadership of the Conservative Party over in the United Kingdom. And the report is, and this is not a big surprise, that Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt lead as of now, the Tory field. Later today, they're going to be having a first round of voting as they try to winnow that field down and move on from Boris Johnson. We'll keep up to date on that as it develops. Coming up, we go to the White House and the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, for her reaction to the inflation numbers. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. President Biden is in Israel, the first stop on his first trip to the Middle East as president. At an arrival ceremony, Mr. Biden said he would talk about a two-state solution for Israelis and Palestinians.
Greater peace, greater stability, greater connection. It's critical. It's critical, if I might add, for all the people of the region, which is why we'll discuss my continued support, even though I know it's not in the near term, a two-state solution.
President Biden's also set for a visit to Saudi Arabia. The hope is that restoring relations with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman will secure a boost in oil production and help ease the U.S. gas crunch. Turkey is hosting talks today with Ukraine, Russia, and the United Nations on ways to get grain exports from Black Sea ports back on track. They've been blocked by Russian troops. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has told the Associated Press his country needs security guarantees for ship owners, cargo owners, and Ukraine as an independent nation. The European Union may launch more legal proceedings against the UK over violations of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the Brexit agreement. Bloomberg has learned the EU could take action before the end of the month. The bloc is unhappy over a bill being considered by the British Parliament that would let the UN unilaterally rewrite the bulk of the Northern Ireland Protocol. A quarter of Americans say their next car will be an electric vehicle. According to a survey by the American Automobile Association, more than 3/4 of them say their interest is driven by a desire to save on fuel costs. Last year, only 3.2% of U.S. vehicles were EVs. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, those CPI numbers were eagerly anticipated this morning, and they did not disappoint, at least not in their blockbuster nature, as we came in with an overall number of 9.1% up year over year, and a core number that's taking out things like food and energy of 5.9%. To give us her perspective on these numbers, we welcome now Dr. Cecilia Rouse. She is chair of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors and the person who advises the president on numbers like these. So, Dr. Rouse, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your take. We heard from the president. He said really a lot of it is gasoline and some things that are already coming down. But we also saw some of the core numbers going up, things like owner equivalent rent.
So absolutely. So I think of these numbers in two ways. First, they are backward looking. They reflect the month of June. And we know that the average price of gasoline in June was higher than it has been in the last 30 days. In fact, if we look at the highest point in mid-June to today, the price of gas has come down about 40 cents. And looking forward, if we look at futures markets, it's looking like the price of oil may continue to drop. So that's a sense in which it's backward looking, doesn't necessarily reflect what we will see in July. But let's face it, this report reflects that inflation is unacceptably high, which only highlights three things. One is the focus of the president on doing what he can to ease prices for Americans. So that is in terms of energy, getting more oil on the market. It's why he has done the historic releases from the SPRO. It's why he's working with our partners and allies to increase more product. We know that oil is priced on a global market. It's also why he's calling on Congress to pass a federal gas tax holiday. All efforts will help. And two, it really highlights why his economic policy is more important than ever, and why it's so important that Congress go ahead and pass his economic policy, his package of reducing costs for Americans in terms of prescription drugs and other costs, and to decrease our deficit. We know that deficit reduction by taking fiscal impulse out of the economy is one way to work with inflation. He wants to do so by increasing taxes on the very wealthy Americans, the wealthiest corporations, and to use some of those funds to make investments in our economy, such as the lowering prescription costs, which we know will, and helping get Americans back to work, we know is important ways of increasing our economic capacity. And finally, the president understands and respects the independence of the Fed, and he wants to give them room to do what they need to do to moderate inflation while maintaining maximum employment.
Thank you very much for that. That was truly helpful, Dr. Rouse. Let me pick up on a couple of things you talked about. First of all, when it comes to energy, we now have President Biden over in the Middle East. Do you expect, as a practical matter, that we should expect any significant reduction in the price of oil because of this visit?
Well, look, this visit, it has many purposes. It's part of a geopolitical strategy, but part of the visit is to ensure that we're working with our partners and allies to get as much oil on the market as we can. We know it's a question of oil production globally. Our U.S. producers are producing a lot of oil at sort of historic levels, but we also recognize we need to get refined capacity on the market. And so he's trying to work with all of our across the country to ensure that we have an international supply of oil that will help to bring down the price of gas.
Dr. Rouse, as I say, any sort of cost reduction we can get at this point is a good idea. Goodness knows a lot of people need relief from prescription drug prices, something you mentioned for possible legislation. But what about the rent question? What about the cost of shelter? Because that is going up continuously. A lot of economists I've talked to think it will continue to go up for some time. Is there anything the administration can do about that?
So that's a really good question. It's one we're very concerned about. We saw in this CPI report that the increases in the cost of rent, the increases in owner-occupied housing, the owner-equivalent housing increase. And there are differences in the way the CPI measures housing versus the PCE, but we understand that housing is a challenge. This is a decades-long challenge. It is why the administration has put forth proposals to increase the supply. We know we have to get more supply of housing that is in terms of builders having the incentives to be building affordable housing. Some of this involves zoning, but absolutely housing is a challenge that's going forward and one we need to be addressing as a nation.
As you know so well, the United States is not the only country facing inflation right now. There's quite a bit of inflation around the world. And one of the things we all focus on globally when we have recession is the people who get hit the hardest sometimes are the people who can least afford it. At the same time, if you try to take some action to give some relief to those individuals, don't you exacerbate the inflation problem? Is there anything we can do to help the less fortunate who are getting hit the hardest?
So absolutely, and we have our eyes on that as well. In the U.S., we have a strong labor market. We got our employment report last Friday, and what we saw is unemployment continues to be at a nearly historic low of 3.6%. It's been that low for about 4 months. We saw an additional 372,000 jobs were added to our labor market. And when we look at wage increases, we saw a decrease, a moderation, I should say, in increases in nominal wages. But we saw that among our lowest paid workers, that there were increases that are even outpacing inflation. So we have our eyes on it. Last year, we updated the Thrifty Food Plan, which underscores SNAP benefits, and we understand other automatic stabilizers will be important as we go forward because we do understand the pain that this causes for families here and, as you pointed out, around the world, which again, here at home, which is why the president really calls on Congress to pass his economic policies to be making the kinds of investments we need to be making in our economy to increase economic capacity so we're able to deal with these kinds of challenges.
Dr. Rouse, obviously these are numbers that are not encouraging to a lot of us. At the same time, you said quite correctly you have to respect the independence of the Fed. But given how the Fed is likely to view these numbers, do you assess that the chances of a recession within the next 18 months are higher after these numbers than before them?
So look, I'm really not going to comment on Federal Reserve actions. But what I will say is this, is if we look to the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and their Business Cycle Dating Committee, they look at a variety of indicators, including the labor market, the employment situation, which we know is strong. They look at industrial production, which also has been strong. They look at household finances, net transfers, which remain robust. So looking at the variety of indicators that the NBR looks at, our economy looks well positioned to deal with the challenges faced by the Fed attempting to cool inflation and Russia's war against Ukraine. But let's face it, we'll be watching and we will be monitoring, and we are really going to be hoping that the Federal Reserve can pull off this soft landing.
You're an esteemed economist, so you're the one who would tell me the NBER gets to decide whether there's a recession or not. But are you confident, Dr. Rouse, that we are not currently in a recession in the United States of America?
When I look at those indicators and I look at the way that I understand the NBER is likely to weight them up, I believe our economy remains robust. But I'm going to be the first to admit that we have challenges that we face ahead. Inflation is unacceptably high. Russia's war in Ukraine continues. But what I will say is, one, we come into these challenges with indicators that continue to be relatively strong. They're moderating. We are seeing signs that our economy is responding to actions that the Federal Reserve is taking, which is what we welcome. That's what we need to see. And this just underscores, it really highlights how important it is that we be making the important investments we need to be making so that going forward we have the economic capacity to be increasing economic growth so that we can transition to strong and steady growth that isn't affected by inflation, and where we have wages that are increasing due to productivity increases, and that those gains are more widely shared.
Dr. Rouse, thank you so much for your time on this very, very busy day. That's Dr. Cecilia Rouse. She is chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Great to have you with us. And a programming note, Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank President Loretta Mester will be live on Bloomberg Television tonight at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Still to come, we look at President Biden's trip to the Middle East, and former Deputy Secretary of State Ambassador Richard Armitage takes us through it. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We were talking about those CPI numbers all morning long, and now we're going to talk about what the markets are doing in reaction to it. And for that, we turn to Cheri Bustos. So first, big reaction now, maybe not so much.
Yeah, 9.1%, a 9 handle on inflation in America, and the market doesn't seem to quite be taking that as aggressively as it did going back in the last couple of months. In fact, you would see over 1, almost 2% declines on those upside CPI surprises now. And you did, I should say, initially see that on the back of this kind of data. Now you're looking at an S&P 500 that's down, 0.3%. That's not the kind of panic that usually ensues after this. But I wonder how much of this is really coming from we kind of expected this. We expected an upside surprise, similar to perhaps the dynamic we saw even a year ago. We'll
talk about the bonds, too, because they went over 3 on the 10-year yield, and then they come back down under 3 again.
They did. And I think the takeaway in the bond story is the 2s10s inversion here, because that, of course, is what we're watching as that recession indicator. We're looking at it. I believe it dropped below 17 basis points. There were calls this morning, David, for it to go as negative as 40, 50 basis points. The last couple of times it's inverted, 2000, 2008, ahead of all of those recessions, it has dropped by much, much more significantly than it is right now. The question is, does it get to that key barrier? And actually put these into Volcker-esque terms, Tom Keene pointing out this morning that in the 70s, that inversion, basically, it went to negative 200. So for me, I think that's going to be the metric you want to watch to talk about just how much panic the bond market is really in. At the same time,
it did take a step down. It's down negative 15 now, and it was above that before. So, okay, thank you so much to Cheri Bustos for that report on the markets. You can catch Cheri again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time when she's anchoring Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, career diplomat Richard Armitage on what goals President Biden can hope to achieve with his trip to Israel and also to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Armitage has spent a career in government as a diplomat and as a negotiator, and he knows his way around, particularly the Middle East. So we're going to talk to him exactly about the relationship with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, and for that matter, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. As we all know, President Biden has traveled over to the Middle East, spending time first in Israel, where he is today, and then subsequently plans to move on to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Our own Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern is traveling with the president. We go to her now in Jerusalem for a report. So, Anne-Marie, first start with Israel. What does the president hope to accomplish in Israel?
I got to be honest with you, David, there's really not a lot the president can accomplish while he's in Israel. For one, there is no Israeli government. That coalition collapsed, and they are looking ahead to November elections. So he's in the hands of the caretaker prime minister at the moment, the former foreign minister, Yair Lapid. He will also be meeting with opposition leader, former prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he'll also be meeting the head of the Palestinian authorities. But there's nothing in terms of a peace negotiation that can be done right now in Israel. But he is just here to reaffirm his commitment to the country. And then he will, though, be the first U.S. president to fly over to Saudi Arabia. The president is trying to expand upon the Trump-era Abraham Accords of normalizing Israeli relationships with other Arab countries. Most notably under the Abraham Accords, there was Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Not just yet is there going to be a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia, but potentially the president taking that flight over. That opens it up for also a breakthrough when it comes to maybe some more agreement when it comes to airspace and things like that, but no massive agreements on that front. So really, this is almost what people are calling like a stop-by trip, because the main event is, of course, going to be when he meets Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman in Jeddah tomorrow evening.
Okay, and let's go there specifically to the meeting with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and what we expect from that. There's been something of a duality in the view here in the United States that you know. Number one, it's all about oil. We want more oil to get the price of oil down, and Saudi Arabia can help us. Number two, it's actually about geopolitics and forming some relations in the region, including, as you suggest, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that will really strengthen the security in the region, particularly perhaps over against Iran. Which is it?
Right. So I think it's a bit of both. So first you have Saudi and Israeli leadership that agree on one thing, and that is their main adversary in the region is Iran. So you can see these countries coalescing around a main enemy for them, which would be Tehran. But for the president, what he wants to get out of this trip, and many would argue he would not be taking a trip to the kingdom in the middle of the summer in July if it wasn't to help a domestic problem he has at home, which was on full display today with inflation topping 9%. And when you look at the CPI for the energy index, north of 42%. Getting gasoline prices down is a #1 concern for this administration, and the kingdom can help in that respect. They have the spare capacity along with the Emiratis, and they're the ones that can shift the conversation within OPEC to put some more barrels on the market. But David, we should be very clear. Saudi Arabia can help fix the market. You cannot fix it without Saudi Arabia. They are the central bank of oil and notoriously the swing producer, but it is not going to come down probably quick enough for the president. So it's a risky bet because, of course, remember, he vowed to make the kingdom a pariah, and he released that U.S. intelligence report that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, approved the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So this is going to be a tricky one for the president, and all eyes will be on not just the statements from these two leaders, but also potentially how they interact with each other. And this is going to play big time at home in his base.
Okay, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for all your reporting over there in the Middle East. That's Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern in Jerusalem. And now we turn to somebody who has been present when those geopolitical relationships around the world have shifted, has been an important participant in the shifting of them. He's Richard Armitage. He's president of Armitage International. Ambassador Armitage has held a series of leadership positions in the U.S. government, including as Deputy Secretary of State under President George W. Bush and as Assistant Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. As I say, you've been there for the creation of some of these geopolitical relationships. What do you make of the president's trip, President Biden's trip right now in the Middle East? What are the prospects? What's the upside?
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Westin. Your correspondent, Ms. Holden, I think correctly characterizes as a tricky trip, but it's true. I think in Israel, he can accomplish something. It is a caretaker government, but given the almost shadow war that exists right now between Israel and Iran, I think it is important that the people of Israel see that the United States will stand by with our ally no matter what. And of course, seeing Bibi Netanyahu is, I think, proper and appropriate in a democracy. The trip to the West Bank, I think, is a little different. It will be very much a stop by, but I think it's to demonstrate again that our view on settlements hasn't changed. And to give the Palestinian people some faint, and I'm underlining the word faint, hope that there may be at some point in time a solution. But I'm not very optimistic, but I think that's the goal of Mr. Biden in the West Bank. On Saudi Arabia, it's more than just oil. First of all, I don't think Saudi Arabia can, although they've got great capacity in the ground, how much they can get out of the ground to help us is a real question. Maybe 150,000 barrels, which is not going to make a huge difference, but they have huge influence in OPEC. And if they use that influence, that could put more oil on the market. It's a course against Iran. The Saudis and the Iranians have held different views, the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf, depending on which side of it you are. But it's also, very importantly, to demonstrate to the countries of the Gulf that the U.S. Fifth Fleet and the United States military is not losing sight of the Middle East and turning all our attention to Asia.
Mr. Ambassador, it strikes me, having read about these, watched these over the years, that sometimes what's as important as who is in the room as who's not in the room. You just mentioned Iran as somebody who will not be in the room. That's one. Another's Russia is not in the room. Of the two of those, if you're sending messages by this trip to Israel and then to Saudi Arabia, to whom is the more important message being sent?
Well, I think we're sending messages to two different people. Let me remind you of a little history. In 1987 or so, we had an operation in the Gulf where we reflagged Kuwaiti tankers. And the reason we did that is so that the Russians could not increase their influence in the Gulf. They had said they would be glad to reflag the Kuwaiti tankers. So we rushed in and did it ourselves to keep them out. I think Iran is much more of a regional problem, but we've seen recently with Putin's discussions with the Iranians that their relationship is getting closer. It has never been too distant. I served in Iran at one time and used to be amazed at the amount of Russian equipment, trucks, jeeps, etc., that the Iranian military had during the time of the Shah. So it shouldn't be surprising that we see those two countries together. But I think we're sending one message to the Russians and a different one to the Iranians.
Mr. Ambassador, let's go to a different part of the world that you know terribly well, and that is Asia, and particularly in the Pacific. We had the loss to a tragic assassin of Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister, who had been, as far as I could tell, a real bulwark for U.S. interests in the region, particularly with his quest for an open Indo-Pacific, perhaps standing up against China. Is there anyone who can stand in Shinzo Abe's shoes at this point?
Well, I don't think there is, but the question right now, Prime Minister Kishida, who had worked as foreign minister for Mr. Abe, has done a terrific job and has a quite high approval rating right now. He has vowed to increase defense spending. He was the first Japanese prime minister to go to a NATO meeting. So in a very real way, I think the present government is trying to carry on the assertiveness of Abe Shinzo. That assertiveness, as far as I'm concerned, was most welcome on the world stage, particularly, as you indicate, in the face of a rising China.
Do you see a path forward to a constructive engagement with China where we don't just give in to them, but at the same time we're not at daggers drawn? I mean, a different way of putting it perhaps is, how can we get to a world where it's not a zero-sum game? Because right now I think that perhaps President Xi sees it that we just want to hold him back, and we think that what China is doing is a real challenge to us.
Well, what's holding President Xi back now is COVID and an economy which is probably only going to grow at negative 2% in the second quarter. I don't think there's any grand bargain to be had, but I think that we ought to look at incremental steps. And I'm talking about a this for that. The president's administration, our president's administration, has indicated willingness to perhaps remove some of the sanctions, which to some extent punish us. And we'll see if we could get a reciprocal but small step from China and therefore move step by step. But a grand bargain is not in the cards.
Are we moving toward a world of blocs, if I can put it that way? That's to say, Russia and perhaps with China and perhaps some others, Iran, North Korea, choosing up sides against the United States and much of the Western world?
Well, probably. We saw a BRIC meeting, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and Iran has indicated they want to join. I think Argentina has indicated they want to join. That's, in a way, I think, an answer to the EU or the G7. I'm not sure what they have in their minds, but we're starting to see the beginnings of that. And it's no question, there is no question, that democracies are under assault. To some extent. They're seen as unwieldy and difficult, and it takes time and things of that nature. There was a recent study in the Middle East released where Middle East countries think that democracies are not so workable. They prefer autocracies. So we may be heading to a situation of two major blocs.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Really great to have you with us. That's Richard Armitage of Armitage International, former Deputy Secretary of State. Coming up, we'll go to Capitol Hill and talk with Democratic Congresswoman Cheri Bustos of Illinois about the politics of inflation. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Well, Congress is very much back in session with a lot of partisan log jams up there. And from those of us on the outside, it looks like maybe not that much can get done. But now we want to turn to somebody who's on the inside actually doing it. That's Democratic Congresswoman Cheri Bustos of Illinois. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for being back with us. As I say, it looks like nothing can get done. But as I understand it, you're actually doing some things there.
We are actually doing something. And you know, it's always kind of the story behind the story. And so thank you for asking that question, and thank you for getting at that. So I told you, David, in between the commercials here, that I just left a judiciary hearing to walk over and vote. I'm standing right outside the Capitol. If you go right through the doors there, that's where I go through to vote. But we just passed something out of the Judiciary Committee, the all-important Judiciary Committee, that would get rid of non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So really major. And it's worth noting, David, that it got bipartisan support. We wouldn't have passed it out of the committee without that bipartisan support. So that is happening. That kind of work is happening at the committee level. The next step for that will be to bring it to the full House floor. And believe it or not, we're working on it on the Senate side as well, so we can get this passed out of the House, the Senate, get it signed into law.
So that is encouraging, I must say, that there are things getting done that are worth getting done. At the same time, we are headed toward those November midterm elections. And at least reading the press, it doesn't look good for your Democratic Party right now. You in the past have had the job of trying to make sure you get Democrats elected to the House. Is it as bad as it looks?
Well, we're still months away from the November general election. And I think it's worth noting that if you just look out after the last 2 weeks, the price of gas has gone down 40 cents, 50 cents a gallon. And if we can continue that trend, and I know President Biden is doing all he can, the entire administration is doing all it can to bring down the cost of gasoline, to get this inflation under control. And we've got months to do that. So here's what I will say is, if you're driving to the polls and it costs you $122 to fill up your gas tank, well, you know, that might create some problems for us. However, if you're driving to the polls and you're seeing that price go down and go down and go down, along with the price of a pound of bacon, then I think we've got a good shot here. But history is not with us. We know that history is not with the party where the president is in the White House, or with the party where we have the control of the House and the Senate right now. However, we have to just keep doing the kind of work that I just explained to you out of the Judiciary Committee. And we've got to have this all-out effort, task force after task force after task force, strike force after strike force, to get inflation under control, to get the gas prices down, and the old saying, to get caught trying every single day to get this under control.
I think I probably have a good sense of what the Democratic message is in urban districts. What about in rural districts? Because you come, as I recall, from a rural district up there in northern Illinois. What about your constituents? What does the Democratic Party at this point have to offer to those constituents?
Thank you for remembering the congressional district I represent. And just for perspective, we have 18 members of Congress in the state of Illinois. All of the Democrats in the House come from Chicagoland. I'm the only Democrat that is what we call downstate. So the district I represent, Donald Trump did win this district in northern, western, and central Illinois in 2016, and he won it. He got the majority of the votes in 2020. So that's the kind of district I represent. So I understand truly the importance of bipartisanship, working together. But what works is that, again, back to what I just said, we've got to make sure that we're showing our 10,000 family farms in the 17th congressional district of Illinois that we're working hard, that we're making some progress when it comes to ethanol blends. The Biden administration made that happen. The former administration would give away these what's called small refinery waivers, like it was candy on Halloween, to these tiny little small refineries like Exxon and Mobil, breaking all of the rules. The previous administration did that. President Biden has gotten that under control. So he's doing all he can to make sure that those 10,000 family farms and the families that live there can say, you know what, Joe Biden's looking out for us. And it's the same thing if 65% of the towns I represent have 1,000 people or fewer. Politically, what we have to do, show up, certainly use our 2 ears and our 1 mouth proportionately and listen to people. And then most importantly, taking what we've learned from these people in places like Hamlet, Illinois, population 48, and taking that back out here to Washington in this U.S. Capitol building, making sure that we vote the right way and that we get results for that.
Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate you coming off the floor to do this, but it's always great to have you with us. That's Democratic Representative Cheri Bustos of Illinois. Coming up, we're going to get an update on the January 6th hearings as they draw near a close. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the House Select Committee looking into the events of January 6th, that's when there was invasion of the Capitol, had another session yesterday, and they appear to be winding down. For a report on what got done then and what's still to come, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew, who's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, what did we learn yesterday, if anything?
Well, it was the 7th hearing by this committee, David, and there were more dramatic stories from inside Donald Trump's circle and inside the West Wing itself, specifically a meeting on December 18th that we've heard some talk about, more detail last night, described as unhinged, with people like Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn in the room, arguments that were had over the best way to respond to what they saw, or at least wanted to show, as election fraud. There were some dramatic moments, some good stories. They tried to connect the dots as well to the tweet that President Trump sent hours later, inviting people to Washington, saying that it would be wild. They cataloged the response from militia groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, but David never really connected the dots between those groups and Trump himself. However, the most newsworthy part of this hearing came at the very end. Congresswoman Liz Cheney making her closing remarks and again invoked the idea of witness tampering being an issue in this case from none other than Donald Trump himself. Let's listen.
After our last hearing, President Trump tried to call a witness in our investigation, a witness you have not yet seen in these hearings. That person declined to answer or respond to President Trump's call and instead alerted their lawyer to the call. Their lawyer alerted us.
And they referred that information, David, to the Department of Justice. It's unclear who that witness was or whether that person will testify at what's likely to be expected to be the final hearing in prime time next week. There's been a lot of talk about what this meeting might include, this final hearing that will now focus specifically on Donald Trump's activities on January 6th during the riot and what he did during the 187 minutes before he finally called off the mob and told rioters to leave the Capitol. David?
So do we have any sense whether Steve Bannon's going to appear or not? We've heard a lot about that.
We have. It's unclear that he'll be involved in this final hearing. We know that the committee wants to talk to him, and we know that he's been cleared to do so by President Trump. But Bannon and Trump wanted to make this a live event, to be able to refute what the committee was saying in prime time. Of course, members of the committee want more than an hour with Steve Bannon, and they don't want to let him run wild on live television, so it's unclear exactly how they're going to manage that. There's a lot of pressure, though, to close the deal on some of the allegations that have been made in their final hearing, David.
Talking about closing the deal, I wonder, do we have any sense of, if that is in fact their last meeting next Thursday, will we know whether they're referring it for prosecution to the Justice Department?
Again, it depends on who you ask on this. Benny Thompson has suggested that this committee is in no hurry and may not do that at all. Liz Cheney says they absolutely must. And the Department of Justice, meantime, David, is conducting its own investigation.
Okay, Joe, thank you so very much. That's our own Joan Matthew. Of course, you can catch him this evening and every weekday evening at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. That's on Sound On, his program. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to Heather Boucher of the Council of Economic Advisors about the CPI numbers out this morning. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.